well, I wasn't necessarily going to post a reflection about playing Khaotic every single time, but really on this, coming up nicely on the learning curve and playing with a somewhat new composition of a group with a new player and with a really interesting game to learn, there's a lot to reflect. So here I am. Still don't know if it's play, reflect, forever, but at the moment it kind of looks that way. So, first of all, I've been enthusing about the game, but let's not overlook the things that I have to overlook in its presentation and in a few of its rules that I'm discovering where, in play, I'm discovering where the gears just really grind. And one of them is that it has introduced opposed roles. Now, the original concept for this system, and you do see it in Legendary Lives Rock Solid, is that the game master never rolls any dice. I think it's probably the first game that I know of where this was the case. And one of the reasons for that is that all the target numbers are listed. I mean, the non-player characters and things to do and obstacles of any kind or whatever are just given a target value. It's an adjective. And you're rolling and seeing, whether you hit that or better. That's the simplest way. There are some ways where you say, well, you've got to hit this value or better to succeed, but your degree of success isn't what you roll, it's the difference from what you rolled, right? And so you look there and say, okay, well, this is, how good I did, even if you may have rolled awesome. Well, the thing you needed to do was great. So you go and you look, how many units, and you take that instead. So there's a slightly different way of doing it, but the basic idea that the other character or thing or whatever, gets no roll. You're not going to take a difference between those. Here that's introduced, and frankly, it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's kind of wretched, actually. So I'm just kicking back. I mean, it shows up occasionally, not much. I'm going to keep it as the combat system because it's there in the combat system with a special defense score for player characters, and I'm just said, okay, you know what, we're going to keep it. It's embedded in the combat system. I'd have to rewrite the whole thing. I don't want to. I'm happy to see how it plays in combat and keep that. But when it comes to, for example, doing something against another character, player character or otherwise, I'm just going to take their value as the target and say you have to hit that or better in order to, for example, influence them or something like that. Usually use that take the difference thing, which still doesn't involve an opposing roll, but you take the difference option when some gradation of response, like how many minutes or whatever is involved. And then you can use that, okay, you beat it by 2, so you get 2 minutes. So I'll keep those, and I'll apply them basically throughout. So good enough on that. I'm happy with it. It also, because the system above a certain number of dice really has these very solid bell curves. One thing I've found in a game that has that per roll, if you have opposed rolls, then you tend to have a real leveling effect in any game where the solid bell curve is achieved by summing dice, which is the case here. Got to look out for that. Everything just sort of zeroes out in terms of ultimate effect, and I'm not interested in that. So sticking with the core of the system rather than this kind of slight add-on that shows up occasionally and inconsistently from place to place in the rules. This game was produced in 1994. I think they'd received a lot of feedback on Legendary Lives that was very reactive, and the whole GM doesn't roll dice thing was probably like freaking people out, and they were like, Vampire has opposed rolls, Shadowrun has opposed rolls. It's 1994. Gotta have opposed rolls, So anyway, that's just speculation, but it seems pretty justified based on the distribution of that in the rules. So another thing is I'm afraid to say, again, rather typical bibble babble in the rules about one player character influencing another. And this kind of has to be seen to be believed, not because it's exceptional, but because it's very, very typical of coping with the concept of all of these very interactive skills. There's tons. They've got them all. Persuade, lie, sincerity, all the psychiatry, all sorts of interactive, influential roles. I mean, there's at least 9 or so different skills that do that. So sooner or later, particularly given the fictional circumstances, it's no surprise that player characters are certainly going to be using them on each other. And in this case, we should say good. Okay? This is really much a game about influencing one another and having opinions, and you're all trapped in the same head a lot of the time. And it seems absolutely required to apply the system well. So what do they say? When a character pits himself against another character, each player makes the appropriate skill roll. The character with the higher result achieves his goal. If a tie occurs, the result is inconclusive. Contestants may have to roll again. Okay. So that's just pitting themselves against each other in any way. And as I just mentioned, that opposed roll business I'm not finding particularly helpful. We already have the non-opposed roll system sitting there in the game, staring us in the face, which is perfectly usable. And there you are. If the roll is to actually have an effect, why don't we just go straight for the effect and just do that? So good enough. Then it says, it mentions they can be different things. But then they move to, they haven't mentioned this in the section, but then they move to influence. So they use the example of seduction being resisted by willpower, which is squicky as an example out of the gate, but we'll leave that aside. Here it says the relevant part. A player should not be forced to obey another character because of a skill roll. Okay, stick with me. Work with me here and accept that before you go, realize that just completely contradicted everything that went before. The character with the higher result achieves his goal. This sentence, a player should not be forced to obey another character because of a skill roll. And we're talking about a whole handful of skills of directly influencing behavior. That's what these skills do. Stick with me that we are getting a mixed message. Now, it says, simply tell the affected player what his character thinks or feels. The player still has final control over his character. Now, if you're nodding here, beware. What does thinks or feels mean then if it's not what the character is inclined to do? Are we saying that the character has failed that willpower resistance, but they get kind of a player willpower backup? So that the character has failed the willpower thing, so is thinking or feeling as, influenced by the other person's role. But like I said, that willpower has, fallen in the onslaught. But now player willpower kicks in and has override. Because that's kind of what it's saying. So then we say, if he doesn't consider his feelings, that is to say that if the player does say, well, I guess I got seduced, but you know what? No. Because it just said a player should not have to obey. Okay, well, if we're going to do that, we're going to say that then. If that's the rule for player characters, I could see how that's going to make people happier at the table, so we'll do that. We've got a contradiction, but we know that it's for player characters only. Breathe. Okay, that's what we're going to do. Then it says, if he doesn't consider his feelings, in quotes, which obviously refer to the induced feelings, you may wish to penalize him for playing out of character by giving him no bonus skill points at the end of the mission. So you do get to have that backup because apparently it's kind of wrong. It says should not have to obey. It's kind of wrong to have your character sort of taken over by someone else's skill roll. So it's, you're given the willpower backup to be, fair. But if you exercise it, then you get skill point. You lose skill points. You get de-rewarded, unrewarded. You're like, so first of all, yes, the skill rolls are made. The opposition rolls are made. Oh, but when it comes to obedience, you don't have to do it. You should, recognize that the character is feelings and stuff. But then if you doesn't, it says if he doesn't consider the feelings, does that mean you get the willpower backup, but you have to role play that the character is struggling against it? You see, I'm starting to have to rewrite the paragraphs in order to find a functional, zone. And at that point, you kind of go, oh man, we're talking out of both sides of our mouth. That's what it's doing. And it's not alone. That kind of text where it's like, well, you should do it this way. Oh, but that doesn't. Oh, but, and then if you do, okay, so you have a way out, but it's penalized. And you're like, okay, bibble babble. You don't know what to do. You don't know what to do at the table. Maybe you do something at the table, but what you're saying here is trying to make everybody happy and isn't what you do at the table, and forget it. So I decided to come up with a rule, which is good for the game, I think, which is that when you're hit by such a roll and overtaken by it, it will influence you. And you should take some action toward it. If you don't, then basically you freeze up and, don't do what you're told, but you kind of lose what you were about to do. You lose your next activity because, if you're sequence of actions, because you had to kind of throw off the influence. It seemed reasonable for a second before you were like, wait a minute. Or so you either do it as commanded, or you kind of just lose a bit while you collect yourself. And that's that. And no matter what, once that hits you and you do something about it or freeze up, then after that, we clear the deck. No, it's not a lingering effect. So that's how I decided to basically write my own use of as many of the principles that I found. Well, you see, that's the thing. I had to kind of look inside which of those principles is really the one that I should pay attention to. Because they're being stated in multiple directions. So that's another example. Don't want to be snarky. There's only one truly hilarious line in the rules, which is the weapons lists are intentionally kept short. You can look at the rules. They're for free. No, the weapon lists are not kept short. Full stop. So, one reads that line and then the pages start turning and you're like, what was going on with that? So anyway, then we move to some things that we discover in the applications of the rules. The ordering of actions in a complex situation. It actually uses Weasley language. It says may rely, on ordering by quickness rolls. Not quite sure what you do if you don't, but it doesn't say. But we'll just say, okay, it's by quickness rolls. Quickness is a skill that's underneath the attribute of agility. When everybody's mind is in the head of a host on Xenos, the character called the boss, the one who actually moves the limbs of the body, cannot use their psychic powers, but they can use their skills with the host body's physical attributes. So everybody can use their mental skills, just by deducing or thinking or perceiving things or whatever. But when it comes to physical activities, that's how it works. The boss uses their skills with the host body's attributes. So then we move to situations in which the different characters, what they're called the crickets, right? The other minds who are aware and looking around and stuff like that, but they can use their psychic powers. And they can also use any of their mind skills, which clearly could involve those rather important persuasive and negotiatory or personally affecting skills amongst one another and upon the boss. I mean, this is kind of a big deal. You can see why having rules for that kind of interaction suddenly becomes profoundly important. And if you don't, if it's all just, okay, role playing only, the dice aren't involved, then it would be. If it were, this is how persuasion, etc. rules work among player characters, then it would be. And then we get this weird thing of, well, maybe they don't work when you say they don't, but then you penalize and you're like, well, okay. So with the rule that I have in mind, this will work very nicely, but ordering matters all of a sudden. If you're talking about fighting, then ordering is no big deal, because then that host body, has its agility, and the boss may or may not have quickness. And so then you make the either very crappy or very good quickness roll for seeing when they go. But what about the minds? They don't have bodies, and they can't use any of their physical skills at all. So it's based on agility, and it's the quickness skill. Does it make any sense at all for them to roll their position in the order using their quickness? The rules say nothing about this. I went and did, after the first session, I went and I did a deep comb through, and there's nothing about that. One could start spitballing. One could say, well, when you're a cricket, then your place in the order is set by, like a willpower roll. And you could do that. Maybe. But I'm trying to keep things simple and stick with the rules, as much as I can, except when I really can't. And so rather than start game designing outward at every opportunity, I'm already kind of, sanding spots here and there, as you see. I don't really want to start extrapolating and adding a box, a text, a sidebar about this. That's kind of what I don't want to do. So I'm saying, I just, put my hand down and said, we're going by quickness. I don't care if you're a mental presence in the head with no body and technically no agility. Just use your quickness. And we're doing that. So when everybody is going, the host body may be surrounded by enemies or something, and we have to know whose shot's coming in when, stuff like that. And then you have all these people chirping away in the head, and some of them are going to be using psychic powers and stuff like that. Others are trying to be telling other what to do or whatever, or maybe even battling with the boss, over who's going to control the body if they don't agree about that. All those things are going on. You need order. You need some sort of ordering mechanism. Everybody just roll quickness. That's it. We're done. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, or is that a physical? Shut up. Let's do it that way. That's all the book gives us. So that's what we're going to do. There's kind of an interesting question on consensus activity inside the host body. And a good example is the decision to go home, which, unlike the jump to a host body, does require an action on the part of the host body, so it would go on the boss's move. That's easy to understand. But when it comes to getting back to Earth, the only requirement is that everybody agrees. So the question is, at the moment of agreement, verbally among all the player characters, does it happen instantaneously at that moment, irrespective of the ordering sequence for anybody? That's one interpretation, because the rules are not clear on this. They don't say anything, is what I mean. And the other alternative is to have the move back to Earth be on the part of anyone, just not some external character, on the initiative point of anyone, once it is all clear through role-playing that everybody agrees. And that's what I decided to do. So at first it may seem, watching the episode, that I was focusing on Margaret as the current boss and that it had to get to her before they could get back. But actually, it could have been when the move went to Albert just before that. But Nathan had Albert wanting to use the psychic power. So they had to wait through that, while everybody else is freaking out and saying, get out. And the only one who was actually, I was very careful to ask Albert, do you concede or agree with everybody to get out? Because if he said yes, then I said, okay, it's your go. You guys are out. But he said, no, I'm using the psychic power. So it had to wait. Then I asked him after that, now do you want to go? Because it didn't work at all. And he was like, now I'm ready. And then I said, okay, now finally we have consensus. We didn't have it before. The next person to go is a player character. The fact that it was the boss is irrelevant, but it is a player character. And now you guys can go. So that's what I did. Related to that was the fact that Nathan was working with a saved action, which he asked. He was actually at the top of the order. He asked if he could save an action and use it later in the order. And given my experience with tons of games which do this, and it's not too problematic, I said yes, and I regretted it. I think that in the heat of the action, the rapidity with which we get through rounds with all these different, mental skills going off and psychic powers in particular, that I'm going to say that there isn't any held actions. If you don't want to go when your turn comes up, it means you hesitated and you lose your chance until the next turn of the season, so to speak. And I really want to get away in this complex way of playing a character from people. Like if we have 3 or 4 people holding their actions as the next action comes up, it's madness. Because then we're going to have to figure out how fast they go in that microsecond of heldness and action. Crazy. No, held actions are not functional in this system. So we're not going to have them. But I only had to learn that through trying it and realizing, this isn't going to go well. It already introduced confusion as to what I can do and when it goes, and especially when it comes to things like going back to Earth as opposed to just taking an action. And okay, I can see that. No. A few other things as of the second session. I think the players are stepping into their characters quite nicely. I particularly like that our new role player is handed arguably the most level-headed of the bunch, the kind of mercenary Russian spy who's there above board, right? The ICES knows that what she does, and she's there to use her skills on this mission as paid by the Russian government in good faith. There's nothing sneaky about her as a spy. She's an operative, right? She's a badass. So she's there for that purpose. She gets it, and that's what she's doing. Then you have our more problematic characters, who are Margaret and Claire. Margaret, as the roles have told us, is not attractive, and Max has said it's because she has this terrible burn scar because there was this, this stuff in her lifelines, some sort of accident or something or crisis, and she said that's where she gets that, and that she's kind of bitter and broken from this. She's a vengeful person who is, seeking respect. So he sees her as a troubled person, and that she was ripe for recruitment to be a mole in ISIS. She obviously already worked for ISIS and then has become a mole for another agency. So, which happens to be this real butthead corporation that's trying to run everything. It's sort of an annoying, profiteering, power-mongering media corp. So anyway, doesn't mean she likes them particularly, but it means that, she's the kind of person who is vulnerable to being turned by them. Claire, who is a character who arguably is, a little less downtrodden, or if that's the right word, a little less broken maybe, but she, was a con artist and considered herself not to be hurting anybody really, scamming people is a way of life, goes to prison, and the charges are way over the top, and she's like looking at really brutal prison sentence and is desperate to get out of that. And now she's in this situation, and Helma has interpreted her character's responses to this to being utterly horrified, unlike some of the other characters. And I mean, even Margaret knew exactly what she was getting into, right? Claire didn't. And she's like in this horrifying situation. People are getting their heads blown off, and there's monsters, and she didn't panic. Well, she kind of did toward the end there of the mission, and is just horrified. She's like, I'm going back to prison. This is awful. gets up and she's pissed at the first person, she associates the terror of the situation, and the characters trying to get used to what they were even doing, with Margaret having been the boss of the throughout that mission. And she's ready to punch Margaret, and we even have a scuffle. And so we see some very interesting things. There's a lot of really crappy rolls in the beginning as the characters are recovering from the mission, easily justified retroactively just by the fact that they're all like disoriented and stressed out and back in their own bodies, and it's freaky. And we see two really strong rolls through the sequence of activities that we did before they had to make their second jump. It was kind of funny. The players are like, "Really?" I'm like, "You're going. There isn't a choice in the fiction. You're going back in." And the sequence, though, that I'm referring to is when Albert basically shuts down all of the strife, the somewhat inconclusive fisticuffs, and the characters, as they say, men and women in their underwear, trying to hit each other and stop each other from being hit, starting to look uncomfortable here. Well, anyway, Albert, shuts it down with a classic, shut up, calm down, kind of well-timed, well-stated psychiatric thing to say. Now, Albert is being played by Nathan, also very much inspirationally off of his sheet, in that he also is obsessed or, determined for respect. And he is a character who has a kind of tough backstory with a major non-player character. And Nathan decided that he actually wanted to be her ex-husband. And that's how he got onto the mission, is he's respected in his field, but is, he's kind of wondering, these missions are really bad news. The only people who've ever come back are horribly, and one person didn't come back, and the others are all horribly psychologically damaged. This wasn't much of a favor after all. And plays him very disconnected and unhelpful. He's supposed to be a helpful kind of guy, but here he's decided, I'm not, very uncharacteristically not helpful in the briefing or the debriefing session, and is real grumpy. But we see him when it comes to the player characters. He actually is like, I am ready to help. I am ready to, assert myself positively, among us. So I'm kind of liking that. I mean, the Albert's character is, a very troubled guy, clearly, but is finding sort of a meaning here, which is neat. Nianzhu, which is Ola's character, is also under a very different kind of troubled guy. He's a really good military scout, field operative, whatnot, but mainly because he's terrified. He's actually fueled on his fear. And so he's good at it, but it's not a good space to be in. So it's kind of an interesting deal there. So we've got this really nice array of characters who are being played quite nicely and interactively. They're not just acting scared. They're not just acting resentful. They're actually riffing off of what everybody's doing and applying these, really feeling themselves into these characters' skins, and starting to see some strength in the way that the roles are bouncing, strength in understanding their character and adding more, especially with Helma, when Claire, who is a pretty self-reliance oriented character, and frankly the word team infuriates her, right? She's not here entirely voluntarily, and the word team means we all get along and have a common goal, and she kind of hates that. But when she is coerced and threatened into having to go back to the transego device, which she does not want to do at all in the first place, and is being forced to do so at gunpoint by a clearly deranged, mentally, off kilter Marine, who says, it's you and me, we're the Americans, we're going back in, I've suborned this technician who's going to send us, we'll be in the creature's head, you and I are going to go kick ass over there. do this and do that. And she's just like, eyes are like dinner plates. She's like, I am not doing that shit. And so her rolls go horribly. I mean, she's being strapped in, right? And the guy's got his gun on her as he's being strapped in, and she is not getting anywhere. He's got this great willpower, and luck hasn't helped her, right? A fate roll, which was a perfectly legitimate roll that I initiated, whether because there's people walking around, in the middle of the night, could possibly run into people if she's lucky. And she said, I'm talking to the tech. Classic case of ascending a non-player character who at this point is just furniture, just basically an extension of Mark. And I still have her roll against Mark. But now she's using sincerity. She's pleading with this is who I am. This is how I feel. You can't do this to me. I don't want to. This is effectively, kidnapping / violation of all kinds. And please, you can't do this to me. And so she needs to basically see if she can do better than Mark's charm, because that's what's affecting. It's his sincerity that's been affecting the tech. So Mark's got a crap charm. Much better situation, but it's not, a done deal. The dice, we've seen the dice, kind of elbow you in the eye once in a while in a really enjoyable way in this game. And that going into a roll, you got a pretty good chance, but, we're rolling because sometimes things don't work out. And so we roll, and she succeeded. And it was just a moment of just relief for everybody that Claire. But you see, all this time, the con artist, the self-reliant, the loner, the involuntary participant, I'm only here because I have to be, all of a sudden achieves this through just raw exposure of her vulnerability and connection, honest connection with another human being. So that's an example of what I mean. We get to see the characters be played, their skin, the players are getting into their skins as written, and then situationally, we're seeing the depth that a player can bring to that profile. And the system's super helping with that. So with that in mind, that's why I want to play these behavioral roles well, enjoyably, and we understand what they do because of what it permits us to do. So really liking that part of it. Lastly, and this is turning long, but there's a lot going on here. Lastly, we're talking about the situational deal. I complained before that the game gives you no way to say like where the characters go when they jump and into whom, and they don't. But it occurred to me, brainwave, during play, that now that they've been there, they have skills that actually could be relevant in getting where they want to go. They've got a geographical understanding of the area, which happens to be super good based on a roll that was made during the first session. And then they have all got memory skills, which I knew I was going to be using during the debriefing, which I did. But them seeing the memory skills in action and how well people did with them, or poorly, I said, hey, what if they want to go to the body of somebody that they encountered? And what if they want to go, to a particular location that they know where it is? They've either seen it or they've seen it from afar, or they have, and then we've got Claire's, understanding of the geography that she's remembered so well. And she'd actually seen notes about it and stuff from the first mission. So, she's got a much better idea than the others of how things are placed in the city. We could actually have, roles to try to, to pinpoint that. We could have a primary person rolling, and others can help either with their memory or with a relevant skill that would help this. We could do that. And so they did a pretty good job, and they had decided that they were, after some debate, decided that they wanted it to be a geographical area, and I nailed it. I said, okay, now I know where they are. Okay, now is they specifically wanted to avoid any of the characters whose names they did know, although there was some debate over that. So by definition, because that's not what they were doing, they were going strictly for geography. I said, okay, absent named non-player characters who, through utter luck of the draw, could be there. No, instead, we're going to look around and I will just say who I think is around and I'll pick somebody. I can do that. If the book says through omission that I'm supposed to choose who they jump into, well, then if they specify a location, then I'll choose who they jump into. I'll take that weight. I just need something to, narrow it. And they chose location. Awesome. I can do that. So that actually I think is a pretty good solution and very consistent with what the rules offer us to do. So I'm really happy about that. Okay. As we proceed, right? As we proceed through. Kind of nice that on their second jump, they started to try to be more organized. I thought it was kind of fascinating that Helma had Claire be infuriated that Margaret had not given over control to the body to Nianzou as requested, although I will point out that Nianzou would have nothing to do with it, at the beginning of that mission. But they had decided this time that they would listen to Nianzou as team leader, but they would have Albert be the first person to become the boss, that whoever ended up being the boss would hand it over to Albert by agreement. That's what we're going to do. And the one person who was furious that, any old person had become the boss and was moving the body any which way that they thought best, is the person who ends up through the willpower rolls being inadvertently the boss to start, which happens to be Claire, the very same person who was totally pissed about that. And did she give it over to Albert first thing? She did not. So I like that too. Okay. See you guys later.